Come with me and you'll be in a world of pure steam locomotion. Take a look and you'll see into old school transportation. Vids you see, made by me, they are good procrastination. Things you'll see will defy explanation. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 10 of my N-Gauge layout build. Today we're going to be looking at making a fiddle yard for the layout. With that said, let's get started. Those of you who have been watching the videos will be familiar with my little layout. I mean, it is pretty tiny, so there isn't really a lot to remember. Here on the left hand side, the track heads through a tunnel and, just like my future, turns into bleak empty nothingness. This is where we are going to attach the fiddle yard. The piece I'm working on here is actually the third complete version of the fiddle yard. The previous ones ended up in the bin. The design I have ended up with isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and as always I've made it way more complicated than necessary, but we'll talk about that later. So we're starting off by cutting out a rectangle, and that's what the track will sit on. It's been made in plywood, and I'm giving it a coat of varnish to protect it and to make it look nice. The next piece of the puzzle is a 3D printed part that will allow us to bolt the wooden rectangle to the rest of the layout. Once it's off the printer, it's time to glue the 3D printed bracket to the plywood. I quickly rough up both surfaces with a wire brush drill attachment, as that's what I had close to hand and I couldn't be bothered to get anything else. With the printed bracket and the base glued together, the next stage is to modify the layout itself so that we actually have something to bolt the fiddle yard into. I'm drilling a couple of holes through the side panel and into the baseboard with the side panel still attached, so that way I know they're going to line up. And then once that's done, I'm going to thread some of the brass threaded fasteners into the baseboard. I forgot to take a video of that, but here's a picture of them once they're installed. Before I got any further with the fiddle yard, I decided to subject it to a series of vigorous and precise tests. Namely, holding it up against my fold-out bench and wangling it around like a 12-year-old with a plastic ruler. And unfortunately, it performed about as poorly as I do after 8 pints. So the plan is to inject some lead into the pencil of our fiddle yard in the form of some lovely pine stripwood. Here I am cutting it out of a random length that I had in the garage and cleaning the end up with a file. I find when using PVA glue, the best method is to first apply the glue to your intended target and then let it breathe a little like a fine wine. Then, very carefully, suck it back up into the bottle, leaving absolutely no trace on the part. Now that the glue has been nicely tenderized, rebirth it back onto the part and proceed as normal. I don't really like having loose parts to the layout as much as possible. I want everything to be kept together. As the railway itself sits in a big empty box, it makes sense to keep the fiddle yard inside that box. We should be able to suspend the fiddle yard here, just above the 3 sidings. I'm planning on using magnets to hold it in place, and these 3D printed parts will hold the magnets, which are 5x5mm, if I remember correctly. I'm starting off by bonding on this little end hider piece. Its only function is to hide the end of the stripwood and make things look a little neater. Once that's done, I then stick on the little magnet holders themselves, again using super glue. and once the magnet holders are on, I then glue in the actual magnets themselves. I printed the holders with a slightly oversized hole, and the magnets fit in there really nice and neatly, and I think they look pretty cool once they're in. This larger piece you can see here is going to go on the layout side. It accepts a metal disc which will attract the magnets, and as usual I just glue them in with super glue. The big old disc holders we've just made require corresponding big old holes to be mounted in. That means we need to call on our good friend Mr. Spadebit to cut a couple of nasty gouges in my nice LED light mount panel. There isn't ever a way that anyone would be able to see these holes when the layout is put together. No one would ever be able to tell that I painted over their edges so that there wasn't uncovered wood. But I know, and now you know. So after putting all that together, it is time for a quick test just to verify that everything works. And it's as much of a failure as my one-man bikini car wash business. Back to the drawing board. So I've decided to switch the magnets out for R-clips because they should be a much more robust solution for suspending the Fiddle Yard. Here are all the pieces I need to convert to using the R-clips, and I'll talk you through them as we go. Luckily, I hadn't glued in the big disc holders that we made previously to the light panel. So to update them to accept R-clips, it was simply a case of reprinting the disc holders so that instead of holding a disc, they will hold a pin that the R-clips go into. I glue those in with super glue into the 3D printed parts, and then glue the 3D printed parts into the corresponding hole in the light panel. The next stage is to figure out the side that goes on the Fiddle Yard, because we need something that will accept the pins on that side that we can then R-clip in place. Originally I wanted to remove the old holders from the Fiddle Yard, which I'd already glued on, but it turns out they're harder to remove than that weird rash I got at university in my special area. So rather than removing them, we're just going to bond a new piece over the top. The one thing about using R-clips and pins is that I need the fit to be really good between the Fiddle Yard and the pins, otherwise it's all just going to rattle around. And because the parts I just printed on could only fit in one position, because I'd already bonded on the previous printed parts, I had to make the holes oversized to make sure that they would be able to go over the pins, because again I'd already drilled the holes for the pin holders on the light panel side. So now what I'm doing is I've got some secondary parts that have a size-on-size hole to the pins, and I'm now going to bond those on whilst they're sitting on the pins, so everything's in exactly the right place. Hopefully that makes sense. So with that all done, I can now use the R-clips to attach the Fiddle Yard to the light panel. And whilst everything does feel pretty secure, the whole thing is super wangly. Doesn't feel particularly professional, it's all kind of wobbling around. It's fine for now, we can carry on with the build, but we are going to come back later and fix that. So that's the main structure of the Fiddle Yard complete, and we can now begin making it functional by adding some track. Unfortunately, I immediately run into a pretty big problem. Let's take a look. Because the track exits the layout at a bit of a funny angle, I can't just have all the track rigidly mounted to the Fiddle Yard, because the Fiddle Yard has to come in at 90 degrees and it butts up against that vertical rib you can see there, so it can only come in at 90 degrees. So annoyingly, that means I'm going to have to make a little adapter piece. So here I am, deep in thought, regretting my life choices, cutting up a piece of set track as the adapter piece. The next piece of the puzzle is a set of points. I'm using insole frog points as they're the simplest to implement. I don't need to do any wiring underneath the fiddle yard. And I'm not too worried about locomotives if they stall in the fiddle yard. I'm going to bond on the points first because they're going to act as the anchor from which we position the rest of the track. So as you can see, the fiddle yard's going to be pretty simple. It's just going to be 2 sidings coming off of the set of points. I've cut the correct length of track with my track cutting pliers and I'm bonding it onto the fiddle yard using PVA glue. I have to say it is fun getting back to gluing track and doing all this kind of stuff. Believe it or not, it's been over 3 years since I laid the original track on the layout. Now that the track's bonded in place, the next step is to add some buffer stops to keep my trains on the track rather than having them fall off into endless oblivion. They're the same simple parts that Pico makes that we used elsewhere on the track. Unfortunately, they are made out of that weird plastic material that doesn't seem to bond particularly well with anything, particularly plastic cement, so I'm using super glue to hold them together, which seems to be the best thing for them. So the next thing is to fix the wangliness that we found with the fiddle yard when it was mounted on the pins. I bought these little washers which were sold as rubber, but it turns out they're actually quite a hard plastic. I was hoping they would be softer so they would absorb some of the movement a little bit better. In hindsight, they're hard enough that I could have just printed them. But either way, hopefully they will stop the fiddle yard from moving around so much when it's mounted on the pins. So as a quick test, I've mounted it to the light panel and the little washers have made a huge difference, which is really good. The fiddle yard feels nice and stable. I don't think it's going to rattle around too much. It just feels a little bit more professional to have it mounted like that. As mentioned before, I like to avoid having loose parts. I knew the R-clips were going to pull an MH370 on me and disappear as soon as I turned my back, so I looked for something that could retain them onto the fiddle yard. I delved into the bottom drawer of my bedside table, and amongst all the other goodies in there, I found this chain. I've also done some hooking and made up these little U-hooks from 1mm-ish aluminium tube that will hold the chain onto the fiddle yard. So I've drilled some holes with my pin vise and I'm attaching the chain using the U-hooks at both ends, using a little bit of super glue to retain it. Also, please pay your respects and pour one out for my poor little boys, the buffer stops. RIP in peace, my friends. So the chain is currently attached to the fiddle yard at both ends, and I'm now cutting out the middle part to leave me with 2 shorter chains. And I did try and capture this on my GoPro, but I only managed to film my crotch. So here's a little tease of that video if you're into that kind of thing. Subscribe to my OnlyFans for similar content. With the chain cut, we're left with these 2 long dangly guys. I'll have to do something about that later, as they're going to make a rather annoying rattle if I leave them as is. In a further effort to reduce loose parts, I am making up a couple of 3D printed parts to hold the little track adapter onto the fiddle yard. The part you're seeing me put together in the background is actually the second assembly I made. Usually with these kinds of functional parts, it will take me a few times to get the design right, so I didn't bother filming the first build as it would be certainly going into the bin. A lot of things needed to go right. The fit of the hinge needed to be tight but not too tight, the pull of the magnet strong but not too strong, the strength of the part needs to be good enough, etc, etc. But somehow, unlike seemingly everything else I do, this design was perfect right out of the box. Either way, we've ended up with a couple of nice little clips. They're hinged clamps held together by magnets with some open cell foam to add a bit of pre-tension and keep the track retained without it rattling around. They also make a very satisfying click noise when you close them. Here I am supergluing them to the top of the fiddle yard using the track adapter piece to make sure they go in the right spot. They seem to work pretty well. Now we're going to look at another 3D printed part. This one is aiming to kill two birds with one stone. It has a couple of holes that the R-clips can go through when they're not in use, and this will stop the chains from flapping around like a geriatric's testicles. Additionally, I've also included a place to hold an Allen key, which is the correct size for undoing all of the fasteners on the exterior of the box. Unlike the track holder clip things, this one did take me a couple of goes to get right. As with the track clips, this little fella is super glued onto the Fiddle Yard, and with that, we're all done with the Fiddle Yard. So after all that, the Fiddle Yard is completely finished. Now that it's done, let me show you the process of fitting it to the layout and we'll run some trains. So we're starting with the Fiddle Yard mounted into the ceiling of the box on the light panel. To release it, we give both of the R-clips a nice firm tug. Then once both of the clips are out, we can pull the Fiddle Yard free. Next, we unclip the adapter piece from within its clamps to release the track. The adapter piece is then inserted into the main track at the tunnel portal. I've soldered on the fish plates so that they don't move around, and that makes this a fair bit easier. Now we can grab the Allen key from its holder and set it aside. Then very carefully push the Fiddle Yard into place, making sure the fish plates align correctly with the rails on the adapter piece. With the Fiddle Yard in the correct position, the final task is to simply tighten up the two bolts which hold it in place. So that's the Fiddle Yard all mounted up. I've filmed a little sequence now showing the new things I can do with the extra space on the track. Looking at it, in hindsight, I should have made the Fiddle Yard a little bit longer. It's bringing back a familiar feeling of wishing I had a few extra inches of length. Fortunately, because it's just a rectangle, I don't think it would be too hard to extend it, so I might get around to that at some point. It certainly is fun being able to bring wagons in and out of the layout. It gives much more of a feeling of a beginning and an end when you're doing shunting operations. The train also looks great appearing from and disappearing into the tunnel. I'm looking forward to filming a full running session with this setup in the future, and also potentially running with digital trains and having maybe 2 or even 3 engines running around on the tiny layout. It might look a little bit silly, but it would be fun. I just need to get around to chipping the locomotives that I have. So that's it for today's episode. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.